Welcome to the Muslim Faculty of Advanced Studies Online. For more information about our programs, publications and membership, please visit our website, themuslimfaculty.org.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Civilization and Society program of the Muslim Faculty of Advanced Studies. This is the second of 12 sessions which make up the Politics of Power module. The entire session will last approximately 1 hour and comprises a lecture of around 40 minutes, followed by a 5-minute interval and ending with a short question and answer period. You're encouraged to make a written note of any questions that may occur to you in the interests of clarity and ease of delivery. The purpose of this session is to paint a broad picture with additional detail, where required, of the geographical, historical, philosophical and political context out of which the French Revolution emerged and into which it spilled over. However, before proceeding, we should remind ourselves briefly at this point as to why this is relevant and why a proper understanding of these matters is necessary. Referring back to the Mabadi, the 10-point introductory framework we looked at last week, the principal fruit or result of this study is the recovery of historical memory and knowledge of precedents, which are the foundation for awareness and understanding of the current political, economic, and philosophical climate, avoiding the repetition of errors and making well-informed predictions. It is in order to grasp firmly how the events surrounding the French Revolution have given shape to the world we inhabit, East and West alike, so that we can recover the baby of Medinan civic order and social justice from the cloudy bathwater of modern democracy and human rights, themselves the direct legacy of the atheistic cry for liberté, fraternité, égalité, and the universal rights of man. So, what do we mean by Europe? Aside from any arguments over whether or not what amounts to a diminishing peninsula sitting at the western extreme of an unbroken Asian landmass has any genuine claim to be regarded as a continent in its own right, the idea of Europe extending from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains has been in vogue since the 1830s. Given the lack of a common overarching federal or other political structure to delineate its constituent parts, greater emphasis has always been placed on the description of Europe in terms of culture and civilization rather than geography. As we will see below, the Christian component of this definition has historically been paramount. Indeed, even to the present day, with the priority on increasing the membership of a European Union that is edging closer and closer, many observers would say, towards some kind of federalism, or specifically towards greater fiscal, budgetary and monetary union driven by the imperatives of the current international banking crisis, the lack of a Christian identity card has appeared to thwart Ankara's long-standing and persistent efforts to be allowed to embark on the accession process with any real hope of acceptance. Coming back to the question of geography, there is general clarity about Europe being bordered to the north by the Arctic Ocean, to the west by the Atlantic, to the south by the Mediterranean, and by the Black Sea and connected waterways to the southeast. However, it has been the case for centuries that the main obstacle to a clear definition has been directly eastwards, and whether or not, or how much of Russia is to be included in Europe, or indeed the extent to which Russia herself, over the centuries, has or has not wished to be included. Although less consequential with respect to physical geography than Russia, we are reminded that our own position here in the UK is not exactly without ambivalence. Some commentators have insisted that Britain's European credentials are no less ambiguous than Russia's. From the Norman conquest to the 100 Years' War, the Kingdom of England was deeply embroiled in continental affairs. But for most of modern history, the English sought their fortunes elsewhere. Having subdued and absorbed their neighbours in the British Isles, they sailed away to create an empire overseas. Like the Russians, they were definitely Europeans, but with prime extra-European interests. They were, in fact, semi-detached. Their habit of looking on the continent as if from a great distance did not start to wane until their empire disappeared. And that's a quotation, by the way, from our main textbook, Norman Davies. Those of you who have managed to complete last week's recommended reading will have gained a fair idea of the complexities involved in these questions. We can conclude, for our current purposes, by taking the so-called common definitions, which places the eastern border along the Ural Mountains, Ural River, and Caspian Sea. For an instant picture of both the physical and political area, you may refer to maps numbers 4 and 29, which are printed in Davies' pages 48 and 1130, respectively. It is certainly the case in the West, by which we principally mean Europe and North America, that our perception of Europe as a geographical and or cultural entity is inseparable from the underpinnings supplied by the history of what used to be known as Christendom. In fact, it would not be going too far to say, more or less, that the concept of Europe is the modern replacement for the medieval concept of Christendom. The modernizing element of the transition, which took place over an extended period of religious conflicts from the 1300s to the 1700s, was introduced by the intellectual developments of the Enlightenment, which, having finally gained the ascendancy in the battle between religion and superstition on the one hand, and the light of human reason on the other, felt the need to replace the name Christendom with something reflecting the more humanistic values of neutrality and objectivity. Hence, Europe. However, the fact that ancient Greek mythology, the legend of the abduction of Princess Europa, was the preferred point of reference for the choice of name after centuries of divisive and unseemly sectarian conflicts suggests not so much a genuine objectivity or neutrality, but rather the continuity of the influence of the Renaissance preoccupation with a transcendent golden age of pre-Christian civilization as the proud and distant wellspring of a common European identity, and the true standard against which all achievements of human culture should be measured. The last official public reference to the res publica Christiana, the Christian Commonwealth, as a formula for Europe was made in the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which effectively brought to an end the War of the Spanish Succession, which lasted from 1701 to 1714. The signatories included Spain, France, Britain, Italy as Savoy, the Low Countries, and Portugal, and established a principle of the balance of power amongst European nations. 4 decades later, Voltaire, who lived from 1694 to 1778, describes Europe in the following way: a kind of great republic divided into several states, some monarchical, the others mixed, but all corresponding with one another. They all have the same religious foundation, even if divided into several confessions. They all have the same principle of public law and politics, unknown in other parts of the world. And 2 decades after this, Rousseau, who lived from 1712 to 1778, wrote, "There are no longer Frenchmen, Germans, and Spaniards, or even English, but only Europeans." Returning now to the long and drawn-out period of religious wars and ideological ferment that led up to the Enlightenment and the birth of many of the intellectual attitudes and political philosophies that would set the tone for the revolutionary turbulence in Europe and the North American colonies. Much of the religious conflict in Europe was the result, directly or indirectly, of upheavals arising out of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation from 1517 to the mid-1600s, or up to 1667, if we're going to include also the contestations that were going on in the East between Russia, Poland, and Sweden. A detailed analysis of the bewildering, multi-layered range of dynastic, geopolitical, doctrinal, commercial, ideological, and ethnic ingredients which fueled such a long and militarily destructive period of contention is certainly beyond the scope of today's lecture. However, the following brief survey of the major conflicts should suffice as a basis for further research. I've included here then the German Peasants' War, 1524 to 1526, which was confined to Germanic Central Europe and displayed complex underlying social and economic causes intensified by inflammatory Lutheran ideas. The Battle of Kappel in 1531 was restricted to fighting between Protestant and Catholic cantons of Switzerland. Then the Schmalkaldic Wars, and I'm not going to spell that for you, 1531 to 1548, and those took place within the Holy Roman Empire and were triggered by Protestant fear of Catholic supremacy. Then the 80 Years' War, or the Dutch War of Independence from 1568 to 1648, which was confined to the Low Countries and stemmed from Dutch discontent with Catholic or Habsburg rule, and was intensified by the spread of reformist Protestantism in a number of its provinces. Then the French Wars of Religion, 1562 to 1598, which was a series of wars and rebellions confined to France and resulted from dynastic factionalism imposed over the conflicts between Catholics and Huguenots. Then we have the Swedish Civil War from 1598 to 1604, which involved Sweden, Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, and Finland, and involved dynastic competition aggravated by Protestant fear of Catholic ascendancy. Then the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, which was genuinely trans-European. It spread over the Holy Roman Empire, Habsburg Austria and Bohemia, France, Denmark and Sweden, and was a major Catholic-Protestant clash interwoven with highly complex political rivalries and strategic maneuverings. And then the Wars of the Three Kingdoms from 1639 to 1651, which were civil wars involving England, Scotland and Ireland. These were various religious conflicts, constitutional tensions between the Crown and Parliament, desire for conquest, the pursuit of the unitary state. And although the situation in the British Isles reflects its own sphere, its own share of the travails which defined this period of Europe's historical development as a whole, it is clearly set apart somewhat from the geopolitical consequences of the hostilities playing out on the mainland. Davies puts it succinctly. In some ways, the British civil wars were symptomatic of strains which surrounded the growth of a modern state in numerous European countries, but they did not inspire any continental emulators and must be judged a tragedy of essentially regional significance. And writing in 1957, C.V. Wedgwood, one of the outstanding historians of the 30 Years' War, observes, almost all the combatants were actuated by fear rather than by lust of conquest or passion of faith. They wanted peace, and they fought for 30 years to be sure of it. They did not learn then, and have not learned since, that war only breeds war. The aftermath of the 30 Years' War, which was ended by the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, leaves little doubt as to the most salient reasons why many turned away from the notion of Christendom and preferred to speak of Europe instead. Davies draws a grim picture of the situation in the years following 1648. Germany lay desolate. The population had fallen from 21 million to perhaps 13 million. Between a third and a half of the people were dead. Whole cities, like Magdeburg, stood in ruins. Whole districts lay stripped of their inhabitants, their livestock, their supplies. Trade had virtually ceased. A whole generation of pillage, famine, disease, and social disruption had wreaked such havoc that in the end, the princes were forced to reinstate serfdom, to curtail municipal liberties, and to nullify the progress of a century. The manly exploits of Spanish, Swedish, Italian, Croat, Flemish, and French soldiers had changed the racial composition of the people. Germany was not alone in its misery. Spain was struggling with the revolts of Portugal and Catalonia, while still at war with France. England was in the aftershock of the Civil War. France was rocked by the Fronde. Poland-Lithuania was torn apart by the Cossack revolt, the Swedish deluge, and the Russian wars. This concentration of catastrophes has led to the supposition of a general 17th century crisis. Those who believe in the existence of an all-European feudal system tend to argue in favour of an all-European socio-political revolution caused by the growing pains of an all-European capitalism. Some argue, in contrast, in favour of a crisis of the modern state, where the peripheries reacted violently against the rising demands of the centre. Others suspect that it may all have been coincidence. It is perhaps also useful to consider here the observations made by the Muslim political writer and commentator Dr. Ian Dallas, writing in 2010, which, while it confirms the picture of chaos and destruction, brings to our attention by contrast the relative political coherence of the English model and the gathering momentum of the Dutch banking-commerce nexus. By mid-17th century, the Reformation had established itself, but not yet allied itself to state structures in the English Henrician style. It now functioned within the vast fragmented countries of the Habsburg-ruled Holy Roman Empire. It was none of these, ready to break up amid conflicting energies, religious, dynastic, and most importantly, mercantile frictions. It was a continental upheaval that began pitting Catholic states against Protestant principalities, but ended up with a French cardinal fighting alongside the reformers against Habsburg Austria, while the financial force of the Netherlands broke free. By its end in 1648, it had claimed 8 million lives. So I'd like to come now to the age of reason. I happened to be relaxing early this morning, only half listening to BBC Radio 4 and quietly contemplating the prospect of this afternoon's lecture, when my attention was suddenly caught by the words, "Not knowing your history is like being a leaf that doesn't even know it's on a tree." I'll repeat that. Not knowing your history is like being a leaf that doesn't even know it's on a tree. I'm not sure who the speaker was, but I thought it worth sharing my impression of this comparison with you today, as I was immediately struck by the focus on the leaves as opposed to the roots, which is the old chestnut, if you'll excuse the pun, that we automatically expect from tree analogies relating to history. My point is, therefore, that rather than just letting it pass, I found myself reflecting not as usual on the great network of solid roots hidden underground, which we take to correspond with the storehouse of history, but rather on the countless exposed, vulnerable and short-lived leaves, which in the special clarity of mind unique to the early morning, I pictured the countless millions of human individuals carried on the conveyor belt of progress from future to present and on into their own isolated pasts without even knowing they are leaves. It would not be possible to do justice to the task of contextualizing the French Revolution without examining the period of the Enlightenment, which essentially produced it and immediately preceded it. And let us say then that was a period circa 1650 to 1789. The following call to rationalism is as good a contemporary thrust into the foundations of the Enlightenment as any I have recently read. There cannot be a clearer mark of the progress of liberty of thought than the contrast between the world views of science and religion, nor of the hard-won nature of that progress than the struggle to liberate the former from the latter. Liberty of thought is the essence of inquiry, and free inquiry produces a conception of the universe totally different from any that thinks the world was created as a theatre for the moral and spiritual destiny of humankind by anthropocentric gods. The story of the rise of science is also the story of the struggle by religious orthodoxy to retain control over how the universe is to be seen and where the limits of legitimate inquiry lie. To make science possible, religion's claim to hegemony over the mind had to be broken. And that is quoted from A.C. Grayling in a recent book of his called Towards the Light. He says further, recognizing the aspiration to that change of authority from religion to science is the key to understanding the Enlightenment, informed in its very essence by the idea that the spirit of science should be extended into all domains. That was what the Enlightenment was, an enlargement of the scientific approach. To put it at its most general, the empirically controlled, responsible, non-dogmatic exercise of reason to wider domains of concern. Major examples of its consequences, to speak again in general terms, are all the revolutions of the 18th century. Proceeding out of the Renaissance, which roughly takes place between the 13th and 17th centuries, the early modern period from the mid-16th century to the mid-17th century marks the rolling out of the scientific revolution and is the platform from which the Enlightenment takes its launch. There is little need to go into detail here, as the familiar names and achievements of the thinkers and philosophers who define these overlapping phases have become iconic. Including Nicholas Copernicus, 1473 to 1543, who represents the bridge from the Renaissance, there follows the likes of Galileo Galilei, 1564 to 1642, Johannes Kepler, 1571 to 1630, René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727, Gottfried Leibniz, 1646 to 1716, and Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1626. And of course, one could name others. The equally familiar roll call of the leading Enlightenment thinkers, or philosophes, as they were known, includes Baruch Spinoza, 1632 to 1677, Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, John Locke, 1632 to 1704, Voltaire, 1694 to 1778, Denis Diderot, 1713 to 1784, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778, and Charles-Louis de Montesquieu, 1689 to 1755. As is clear from many of these names, the salons of France were a pivotal creative centre of the phenomenon of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is usually cast in political and ideological opposition to the absolutist monarchism of the times, particularly in its manifestation in the form of the divine right of kings. No figure of the period embodied this reality more decisively or more flamboyantly than the so-called Sun King, Louis XIV of France, who reigned from 1643 to 1715. Hence, it comes as no surprise that the response of the philosophe is particularly energetic. By way of comparison, the situation in the British Isles is set in the context of the Wars of the Three Kingdoms referred to earlier, which include the English Civil War of 1642 to 1651. It is interesting to note the novel way in which the limitations on the power of the monarchy were eventually achieved. In Ireland, the solution was a bloody conquest at the hands of the Dutch prince King Billy, William of Orange, who reigned from 1650 to 1702, and his Orange men at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. In Scotland, the matter was settled at Glencoe in 1692 with the traitorous massacre of the Clan MacDonald by the Campbells. In England, meanwhile, the so-called Glorious Revolution, with the declaration of the Bill of Rights in 1688 to 89, set the seal on an easy and convenient introduction to the era of constitutional monarchy. And quoting from Davis, he says, "The Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 9 therefore was not especially glorious nor revolutionary. It set out to save the political and religious establishment from James's radical proposals, and it was brought to fruition through the only successful invasion of England since 1066. Yet, in subsequent generations, it would spawn a powerful myth. It lay at the root of a constitutional doctrine which came to be known as the English ideology, and which postulates the absolute sovereignty of Parliament. This doctrine holds that absolute despotic power had been transferred from the monarch to the elected Parliament. In theory, at least, it gives Parliament the power to rule with all the lofty authoritarianism that was previously enjoyed by England's kings." Events in England from the 1630s to the 1690s, combined with the writings of the political theorists Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, make a key contribution to political developments in Europe and the Western world in general, since although the practical outcomes in England differ essentially from the doctrine of the sovereignty of the people, as it was to develop in most of Europe and North America, the political writings which these processes generated can be said to have been instrumental, for better or for worse, in opening the way to the American, French, and, at least initially, the Russian revolutions, as well as the development of representative liberal democracy as we now know it across the world. The final matter that is worth looking at with respect to the European context concerns the questions of industrialization and modernization. However, as our approach at this stage of the programme is essentially descriptive rather than analytical, I'll include it as part of this week's recommended reading. That brings us to the end of today's lecture. For further reading, I would recommend Europe, A History by Norman Davies, pages 764 to 768. And the subject of our next lecture is the French Revolution, Part 1. For preparatory reading, I would recommend, again, Davies, pages 693 to 715. Thank you for your attention. Assalamu alaikum.
Did these Protestant and Catholic conflicts in Europe at the time, which you spoke about, begin with Martin Luther and his declarations against the Catholic Church? There was something happening before that was tensions in the European society with the
So your question is, did the conflicts in Europe, which we refer to as the Reformation, did they actually, did they start with Luther's declaration of his 95 Theses?
What seems so bloody?
Well, the fact of the matter is, that posting of those theses is taken as the beginning of the Reformation. But clearly, what was going on before, because these things don't never take place in isolation, set the scene that allowed that declaration by Luther to be so inflammatory. So basically, all of the years throughout centuries, certainly towards from the middle and towards the end of the Renaissance, the abuses of the Catholic Church, too many to mention, but there are all these questions of the pecuniary exploitation of ordinary people, the power, the jockeying for power, the doctrinal matters concerning things like transubstantiation and so on. All of these things combined together, meant that the time was right. It just reached a point where enough was enough.
Was Luther, the first manifestation of all those frustrations?
No, it can't have been. I couldn't name names at this point, but there are always. There are things that are going on, and other individuals and other incidences and attempts to resist the Church, to resist the Pope, all kinds of things going on before and even also in parallel. But as with history and the unfolding of events, there are some which are catalysts. They happen at the right given moment. And at that point, they suck up all of the other energy that's already boiling away, whether under the surface or on the surface. Yes.
This is an extraordinary, complex whole picture we've got here. I think, Michelle, I've understood, we have this Enlightenment related to the French Revolution, and which was at odds with the traditional Catholic body of thinking. Is there also a third strand in this, in that there would have been an input from the Arab lands, and what I'm trying to get to some kind of idea is that somehow the Enlightenment was also influenced or could be added to by the Arab thinkers.
That's possible. Oh, sorry, your question. Your question actually then is whether or not there are influences from the Arab lands which impinge on the processes of the Enlightenment. That's another layer of complication. The answer has to be yes, in the sense that the gathering up of the tensions that had taken place throughout the period of the Crusades, and the forced coming together and comparison of beliefs and modalities as Christendom and Islam then came into contact has to be a fact. The business of quantifying it is a difficult one, but an interesting one. But it's certainly beyond me at this moment to give it a quantity or to describe in detail what some of those strands might have been. But the answer to your question, it has to be yes. But if looked at, if you like, going back to the analogy of roots and leaves, if looked at from the position of leaves, then it doesn't appear. It doesn't appear, but it's hidden, it's there in the roots.
How would you place Henry the Eighth in Britain? Would you say his whole learning what happened, how we dealt with the situation in Britain was possibly a look at what was happening on the continent?
Certainly. So again, your question is the role of Henry VIII and his reaction and response to what was taking place on the continent. Yes, I mean, he was, in a sense, again, his reign and his development as an individual was straddling early modernity and late Renaissance. And so his involvement with Europe, as a source of, identity and behavior and standards and culture and so on, is totally, at one with his counterparts on the continent. What the standard historiography has neglected until very recently is an appreciation of his total awareness of the aims of the Reformation and an active desire to bring about those aims in his own realm, as opposed to the stories or the versions that constantly emphasize his determination for a male heir and the need to have as many divorces as he needed in order to attain that goal. So I know that there have been, things that have been published recently which, redress that balance somewhat. Sorry.
Yeah, just earlier when you were talking about the, you said that Rousseau and Voltaire, they formulated some of the ideology. And was that anything to do with language or culture, like nationalism in the 19th century? Or was it something like, if it was based on Greek culture, or was it based on something else?
Right, Rousseau, Voltaire, and their expression of Europe and the extent to which that was involved in ideas of nationalism. Am I understanding you correctly?
Well, in the 19th century, wasn't the idea of nationalism formulated very much around, an indigenous culture, indigenous language? So
Yeah.
I'm just wondering what their actual formulation of this identity was of Europe. Was it based around that? Was it something separate from nationalism in the modern sense?
Yeah, no, it was. So again, so your question then is whether or not the likes of Rousseau and Voltaire, in their perception or description and so on of Europe in their day, lay at the basis or is in some way related or connected to the development of nationalism in the 19th century. With that's actually a tricky question. I would probably focus on the Renaissance first of all, as the as the standard of certainly the source of a common European identity, first of all. And then the fact that, as I think I quoted from, I think it was Rousseau, wasn't it, who said, there are no longer Frenchmen, Germans and Spaniards, or even English, but only Europeans. And so in that, one detects really a very clear expression of, in a sense, of an anti-nationalist tendency, but rather the preference for a European identity based on these antecedents that arise out of the Renaissance and arise out of the exchange of ideas, which, as I described in the lecture, are all to do with the Reformation and the scientific revolution and so on, with reason, the promotion of reason, and escaping really from the restrictions of the religious domination of thought.
So I mean, if it's not they were anti-Christian identity, they were or they just didn't even think of a national, a language or culture-based identity. So I mean, what identity? You're saying it was a scientific and technological identity, or some sort of...
Oh no, sorry, no, I'm not saying that it wasn't a linguistic or cultural identity. It absolutely was. But what they were celebrating in statements like that was the power, if you like, of the vernacular languages then, at that stage, which they expressed in their own, were able to express in their own languages, which was now mirroring what would previously have been confined to either Latin or Greek. And so, yes, I mean, the language or languages as a matter of components of that identity was absolutely crucial. And and the related and other cultural manifestations of what would have been seen at that time as progress.
I'm just wondering what they're actually saying Europe should unite around, I mean, what is it? It's like
well, what they're uniting around, again, if going back, I mean, to the other quote, the one from Voltaire, he describes Europe as a kind of great republic, divided into several states, some monarchical, the others mixed, but all corresponding with one another. They all have the same religious foundation, even if divided into several confessions. They all have the same principle of public law and politics, which is unknown in other parts of the world. So these are the factors which he identifies and which sound incredibly modern even now in terms of what Europe should be striving to unify around. Things are different now, of course, because Europe is really being forced into unity around the exigencies of the banking crisis, which is somewhat different to what Voltaire was calling for, but in a way it calls into being the possibility of political structures which are being imposed on the whole of Europe.
This is so extraordinarily intricate. If we go back to the idea that you had Catholicism versus Enlightenment, and by that we mean reason and science, and with Enlightenment, i.e. reason and science, leads to this dreadful revolution, we're actually saying that reason and science are a bad thing. I'm unable to get my head around that. And I'm adding that the Arabs would have brought a lot of that reason and science with their thinking. And surely we don't want to go back to Catholicism, do we? We want reason and science.
Right. So your thought is that, given what we've just described, and all of the conflicts and so on over, between religion and progress in the age of reason, can't be a good thing given the cost. All of this really is a question of a worldview that rejects the divine and deifies, in place of the divine, man himself. Now, when you refer to the Muslims and an approach to reason and so on, which would not lead to the same dreadful consequences, then it may lead to dreadful consequences, but because of the events of history, not because or not for the same reasons, of shirk and the universal injustice of idolatry, that it's the worst form of both spiritual and social decay and iniquity that could be. So clearly, if one at least takes the divine back into the center of one's life transaction, then the tensions set up by the injustice of idolatry don't exist. However, historical events are historical events. And it's one thing to imagine in some kind of utopian conception that left to their own devices or to our own devices, the Muslims would certainly, avoid the worst excesses that we saw in the Enlightenment onwards. But in reality, would we be left alone to pursue these achievements? Can we predict now what we would be faced with by way of another counter-reformation, let's call it, coming from the same sources that produced the Reformation we've just been looking at? And so, yes, one can speak theoretically about yes, that we wouldn't, and yes, no, we certainly wouldn't go down the same road. But we won't discover what is on that road until we embark on it. Can I take it that there are no more questions? Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.